This is Brandon Kelly, the host of Blue Wire's new podcast, Golden Goal.
Messi takes everybody on. Messi has got it!
From Lionel Messi to Marta to Pele, our show takes a deep dive into soccer superstars.
2-0 and is. What a World Cup for Megan Rapinoe.
From Zlatan Ibrahimovic's brash confidence with the play to back it up, to Megan Rapinoe's heroic outspokenness and World Cup flair. Each episode examines a personality of the world's game. We'll dig into Maradona's Hand of God performance and subsequent downfall, the teenage trio at Dortmund that signaled the next generation of superstars, and that infamous headbutt that slung Zinedine Zidane from glory. Golden Goal, soccer stars and the moments that made them. Premiering this summer on Blue Wire.
What is crack-a-lackin', Hardwood Knocks listeners? I am Dan Favale, coming at you with, as always, Adam Frommel, founder and editor-in-chief of NBA Math, and also an editor extraordinaire at Bleacher Report. Follow him on Twitter at Frommel09. We are continuing with our decade ranking series. We have the top 10 players of the Memphis Grizzlies over the past decade, as chosen and ranked not only by Adam and myself, but also you, the listener. Get excited. First, though, our usual housekeeping notes. Please, pretty please, with sugar and cherries on top, or however that saying goes. Brain fart right there. A brain fart while talking about a brain fart. Spectacular. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you're getting your podcasts, assuming they allow ratings and reviews. They definitely allow subscriptions, though, so wherever you're consuming your pod, subscribe to us, download our episodes. If you've done all those things, we appreciate shout-outs, retweeting our promos on Twitter, word of mouth, telling your friends, family members, coworkers, acquaintances, random people on social media. We appreciate it all. And on iTunes specifically, whether you're using it or not, all ratings and written reviews go a long way, and we are staying on top and reading all constructive criticism. So please, we take it to heart. Thank you in advance there. Follow us on Twitter at Hardwood Knocks. You can follow our YouTube channel, which has all of these Decade Rankings podcasts in one convenient playlist. Go figure. YouTube.com, search Hardwood Knocks. We will come right up. Subscribe, please, and thank you. Last, but certainly not least, shout out to our sponsor. As always, betonline.ag. You'll be hearing from them in just a couple of moments. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm glad that I get to sit down to record this with you because my quads are dead. I think I was telling you before that we got a bike seat for my 18-month-old child, and I haven't been on a bike in a long time, and biking around a hilly city with a 30-pound anchor on the back of the bike is destroying me, not even that slowly.
Ironically, the last time I rode a bike was probably a half decade ago near where you live. It was in Denver. So it's very hilly there in certain points. So
yeah, I don't think I realized just how hilly it was until I started trying to navigate it on a bike with a child behind me.
Look, we got to be real, though. For people who've never met Adam, which is the vast majority of our listeners, it really is time that he kind of works on the quads, though, just because he has these massive tree trunk calves, and now he's going to get the quads to match. So if you've ever wondered whether I have calf envy of anybody tangentially related to NBA Twitter, it's Adam Frommel. Follow him on Twitter at Frommel09 for all his tree trunk pictures that he does not post.
I don't even know how we're going to recover from this now. Where are we going to go from here in this podcast?
Well, you need to, first of all, social media now needs to see your quad progress because we've bragged about your calves. But this feels like a very natural, organic segue into the Memphis Grizzlies.
It does, because I definitely just associate gigantic calves with them at all times.
Yeah. Not, if Marc Gasol was still there now, maybe not so much at this time since he lost like 80 pounds. I don't know if anyone saw those pictures of him. I'm very curious. This is only semi-related to this. I want to see if his game or Nikola Jokic's game is impacted at all by what appears to be this profound weight loss.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we don't really know if it's going to backfire or not, just because I think more so with Jokic than with Gasol, like their game is kind of predicated on the heft and knowing how to use that. And I don't know if increased mobility and quickness will counteract any losses in just sheer size.
I think it stands to help Gasol more than it will help Jokic, just because one, he's older, and so being lighter on your feet is probably better. And then the other thing is that I was writing about this. I don't know when. Maybe it was very recently, but when Gasol was traded to the Raptors, he averaged over 6 post-ups per 36 minutes last year. He's down to around 2 this season, so he's just not working down low as much. And if you're going to have to cover, maybe it hurts you against a Joel Embiid type, but if you're going to have to cover all these other mobile bigs or just even guys like Brook Lopez who shoot from the perimeter and you need to be able to close out on them in certain situations, I think it ends up it stands to help him more, or at least hurt him less than it would Jokic, who is, equal parts, he's guile, but he's also force and finesse. And does he lose that force aspect? That literally has nothing to do with this podcast, though.
Nothing whatsoever. But neither do my Cavs. So that's basically like the theme of this podcast.
The first 5 minutes are throwaway minutes for Memphis Grizzlies fans who only want to hear, although they should be interested in how Gasol's doing. Anyway, though, so can you take us through to start us off with the top 10 Memphis Grizzlies of the decade? And just as everyone who remembers, since it's been a couple weeks since we last published one of these, Adam and I ranked our top 10 players for the Grizzlies of the decade, and then we also had a form that many fans filled out, and so that factors into the composite rankings as well. Without further delay, finally, though, I throw it to Adam.
Yeah, we're always so thankful for the responses that come in, so please continue voting as we put out those polls. We are halfway through with this one, which is kind of hard to believe, both that we're only halfway through and that we've made it halfway through. But again, that's neither here nor there, which is the theme of this podcast. So I will say that OJ Mayo barely missed the cut, and he lagged just behind Jonas Valanciunas, who checked in at the 10th spot in our composite rankings, which again are based on the fan vote, my vote, and Dan's vote. So Valanciunas actually did not appear in the fans' top 10. He was bumped in favor of Mayo and checked in at number 11. He was number 8 for me, and he was number 10 for Dan. Definitely a guy where the there-ness factor that we've talked about on these episodes so many times does not really help him out. He's only 24th in minutes played for the decade, which dates back to 2010-11 for our purview here. But in that brief time that he's been in Memphis, I think that he's continued to emerge as, in my opinion, one of the most underrated players in the NBA, especially now that he's adding more perimeter elements to his game. Just a guy who is constantly efficient, who knows his role, who maximizes his contributions in that role, who contributes on both ends, a fantastic rebounder, not a guy who's going to put up glamorous scoring numbers, but he doesn't need to in order to thrive.
And he can put up scoring numbers in a hurry, though, if he needs to. And that's what's really intriguing about him, is he'll have that offensive output, even if you kind of consolidate his role, which Memphis has done to some extent. And he's also kind of timeline proofed himself. He's hitting 36.7% of his threes this year on a career high 1.7 attempts per 36 minutes. He can still really finish out of the pick and roll extremely well. And look, he's averaging 1.24 points per possession as the roll man this year, which is in the 74th percentile. And he's also one of 10 players shooting better than 50% on at least 3 post-ups per game. So he's really just merged what you want from a contemporary big. Yeah, where you don't want to see him face up and put the ball on the floor necessarily from beyond the arc, but he stretches defenses, but then he also still kind of has that brute force to his game. And I think what's also important to remember is that he's probably a neutral defender, and I think a lot was made of what happened to Toronto in certain seasons during his time there. He's never going to anchor a really good defense. And so if he is your primary or only back line of defense, you're not going to have this exceptional defense. But when you have other options, either really competent perimeter defenders around him, or just someone who he can play in tandem with in the front court where he can focus on rim protection and doesn't have to come out of the paint as much, he's going to be just fine. And so I think that's I think it became clear when he, towards the tail end of his time in Toronto, when they were still good defensively with him on the court, but it's also been clear in Memphis where they've had an above average defense with him on the floor. And I think he's made an impact over, the past fewer than 2 seasons. I don't even really know how to phrase that he was an easy inclusion in the top 10 for me, even though it hurt a little bit to leave OJ Mayo out.
Yeah, he was an easy inclusion for me. And I think that especially during his time in Memphis, I really associate him with that combination of physicality and finesse. Like, he's a guy that can use his size to overpower people down low, but he also has a pretty smooth mid-range jumper. He's one of those few bigs who I'm okay with you taking those 20-footers because he makes them pretty consistently. And just having a guy who does force defenders to pay attention to that space is valuable in and of itself. It's telling that Memphis has consistently been better with him on the court. And I don't think that's just a function of who he's playing with, because he does, in his own way, kind of warp how defensives have to pay attention to the big man for Memphis.
Yeah, and he's looking at his contract, he's one of those where, he's making comfortably in the 8 figures per year, and he's not what you would call I don't even think I've used this word in a while, but a unicorn big, but you feel comfortable paying him that money. He's also a little bit younger, I think, than most people realize. This was his age 27
right, only
season.
28, yeah.
Yeah, so he just turned 28 in May. That really just helps him out looking forward, not necessarily in this discussion.
Yep. The next guy on our list is not as young as Jonas Valanciunas, and that's Vince Carter, who checked in at number 10 for the fans, number 9 for me, and number 8 for you. I do wonder if there's a little bit of sentimentality here, just because Vince just announced his retirement as we were voting on these finishes, and I think it's natural to remember a player who is considered in such a positive light throughout his NBA career, maybe Toronto fans notwithstanding. He wasn't great in Memphis. He spent 3 seasons there, very much like his continued maturation into a role player rather than a star. But
40.8% on twos while he was in Memphis. That's not great.
Yeah, the shooting numbers weren't great, but I think just like the leadership alone mattered. On those teams that were trying to get over that playoff hump as they established themselves as consistent postseason participants. I think he's one of those guys where his value goes beyond anything that we're going to see on a stat sheet.
Yeah, and look, it was clear in Dallas, but in Memphis as well, his defense, I would say, improved as his career went on. And so to have someone who he's not a lockdown wing stopper, but you could kind of trust him to work hard on that end of the floor, and he was using space, and he was using his intellect more so than his physical tools at this point. And so I think that focus, which probably shifted at some point, I think, while he was in New Jersey, maybe even in Orlando, if you want to go that far, definitely by the time he was in Dallas, to become someone who can defend some fours in spots. And that really started, I think it was in Dallas, but it also happened in Memphis a little bit too. But someone that you could throw on 2s or 3s as well, and you don't think that you're going to get absolutely torched. That's really where a big part of his value came in. And he was, by this point, only 34.8% from 3 during his time in Memphis, but he was very much plug and play at this point in his career as well. And so when you kind of throw in the there-ness factor too, he's 9th in minutes for the decade on the Grizzlies too. Played for some quality Memphis teams. I definitely feel comfortable putting him in the top 10, me putting him at 8, ahead of Jaren Jackson Jr., who, spoiler, I had at 9. Maybe that's a little bit of sentimentality at play, but I think he absolutely belongs in the top 10, unless you're just incredibly high on OJ Mayo.
I almost want to give him more credit for being 9th in minutes just because of the stage of his career at which he accumulated those minutes. Like the final of his 3 seasons in Memphis was his age 40 season, and that was 4 years ago. I mean, it's like, just thinking back on his career, it's ridiculous. Like, just how much time he's spent in the NBA.
He's played in 4 different decades, man. He's like age 80.
He's played in 4 different decades.
I'm really upset.
And he's dunked in 4 different decades.
Right. I'm really upset that we didn't get an opportunity to just like appreciate his retiring, because you knew it was happening this season, but you thought you had more time, like a quarter of the season essentially left with him, and all of a sudden we watched Vince Carter play basketball for the last time.
Yeah, and I know it doesn't have anything to do with the Grizzlies, but I do just want to say that I'm really excited to see what comes next for him, because he's been a consistent presence in like summer league broadcasts and the occasional NBA TV broadcast, and he's fantastic. Just the ability to give measured insight, to appreciate the stylistic changes that the NBA has undergone in the last couple of decades, which he has been a part of, and to not want to put down the current generation of players, but instead prop them up. Like he's been a really consistently positive presence on every broadcast that he's been a part of. And I really hope that portion of his career gains prominence.
Look, Vince Carter, if you want to come on and be a co-host of the Hardwood Knocks podcast, you're in. I won't even need to interview you. So if you're looking to make that transition to the podcast world,
I would.
At Dan
I would
Valley.
still interview him. Yeah.
I'd still interview him. Attention Hardwood Knocks listeners, there is no shortage of action going on at our exclusive partners, betonline.ag. Sports are slowly making their way back, and BetOnline is leading the way with the best odds and lines for all UFC, NASCAR, boxing, and soccer matches. And if you need even more, they have simulated NFL, NBA, and UFC events all day, every day, live on their website. Looking for something else other than sports? BetOnline has hundreds of casino games, poker tournaments, and prop bets to check out. Visit betonline.ag and use promo code BLUEWIRE, all one word, for a free welcome bonus. That's one word, BLUEWIRE. BetOnline, your online wagering experts. Can you take us to the actual, or the composite, number 8?
Yeah, number 8, we have Jaren Jackson Jr. He was 7th in the fan voting. He was down at number 10 for me, and he was at number 9 for you. It's weird because his career is still so young. It's still filled with so much hype because of, how much excitement he carried with him when he entered the league as the number 4 pick of the 2018 draft. But then these first 2 seasons have felt disappointing, and yet it still feels like he's an obvious inclusion. It's a seesaw here.
Yeah, his first season wasn't disappointing to me. His second season, it felt like he plateaued, and the same defensive issues are still there for him. And so for people like myself who thought he was going to be an All-NBA player at both ends of the floor, I do think you may need to reassess whether that's still possible on defense. He's still so young. This is just his second season, and
he hasn't
maybe
turned 21 yet.
Right, he can't even order a mimosa legally anyway. So there's still a chance that he'll end up improving. Won't commit as many fouls on that end of the floor. Can hold up at center against bigger, stronger players. I really like that he can still score within the flow of the offense. He doesn't hesitate to bomb threes at this point. I think that's going to be very important. When he does put the ball on the floor, it does kind of feel like he's in slow motion, but he is under control. And so I feel like there are more planes of his offensive game for him to explore. I just don't know if he'll get to now that Ja Morant has come in and so clearly become this franchise's future, and rightfully so. And I also think that contributes to the disappointment a little bit, is that you had this Ja Morant ascent, and now Jaren Jackson Jr. isn't necessarily less important to their future, but he's a little less prominent. And if you're going to weigh that in tandem with his sort of plateauing from his rookie year, I think it's fair to say, or maybe that's an impetus for calling his sophomore season a letdown. But I do think it's fair to say that, you are a little bit disappointed in his sophomore campaign specifically. Still, guys who stretch the floor and also can just score, it feels like 25 points per game within the flow of the offense. That's really important, particularly when your floor general is going to end up being someone like Ja Morant, who needs to dominate the ball. I have no doubt that he can do things off the ball, but you want the ball in his hands just because of everything he does with his escapism, his playmaking, his ability to create shots for himself.
The fouls are the biggest issue for me. And I think they stem both from a need to bulk up a little more so he can capably handle the physicality of other front court players, but also just discipline and having better reads on defense. I think we see him too often bite for fakes, bite for passing lanes, and then be forced to recover and end up fouling. But you can't average 5.2 fouls per 36 minutes as a rookie and then 5.2 per 36 minutes as a sophomore. Like, that's an area that you need to improve in, especially because when you limit your playing time through whistles rather than a lack of opportunity, and you're a really talented scorer who's putting up over 20 points per 36 minutes in efficient fashion because you can score from all 3 levels, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. It's like earlier in Jokic's career when he was starting to become a star for Denver, and he had those frustration fouls in transition where he just like kind of bear hug a guy, like a very EuroLeague style of foul.
I feel like he still has those too.
He does still have those occasionally, but he's at least cut back on them. But that hindered his progression and his growth into a total star. And I think we're seeing something similar, albeit to a lesser extent, from Jackson, where if that part of his game doesn't improve, it almost isn't going to matter how much he progresses in other areas because he's capping himself to 28 minutes per game.
And it also hurts because he's very clearly going to be a better, I don't want to say perimeter defender, but just better suited at the 4 spot than the 5, at least for the foreseeable future. The Grizzlies are in the 30th percentile this year when he plays center of points allowed per 100 possessions. And there are just parades at the rim. Around 40% of their opponent looks come at the rim when Jarrett Jackson Jr. plays center. And so that's an issue. But he's also shown that when he's more disciplined and he's out in front, like he can really get up and contest these jumpers and force the ball out of opponents' hands. And so he can be a very effective defender. A lot of it, though, feels like it's going to come down to discipline. And then, of course, as you already mentioned, there's going to be that strength factor if you want him to be even a split time 5, not even just a full time 5, but if you want to kind of straddle the line and just do a 50% split at both the 4 and 5, he's going to need to get stronger.
And I do just want to say that we're not trying to hate on Jaren Jackson Jr. or anything. If anything, it's because we're both so excited about his potential and enjoy watching him play so much that we're being critical. Like he was an obvious inclusion in the top 10 for Memphis over the last decade. And the ridiculous amount of potential that's to some extent lying dormant is the impetus for the criticism here, not criticizing for the sake of criticizing.
Right. And look, like I said, I thought he was going to be an all-NBA caliber player on both ends of the floor. And I think probably one of the highest compliments you can pay to him is to demand more or expect more from him like we kind of do at this point. And the other thing is, even as he is right now, there's still a case to be made that he's a top 75 player in the NBA. There's still a case. And he's still top 100 to me. Maybe not in any given game. He can look absolutely terrible. But because we can say that, and we also don't feel that he's come close to sniffing his peak or even making upward progression at this point, that says a lot about what he seems to be capable of.
Absolutely. But let's move on to our two-way tie for 6th place in this top 10. The first of those 2 players is JaMychal Green, who was 8th place for the fans. He was 6th place for both Dan and I. And as a spoiler alert, from this point forward, we have unanimity between Dan and I in our rankings. I am in no way qualified to talk about JaMychal Green on a podcast with Dan Favale, who is probably the biggest JaMychal Green fan outside of JaMychal Green's family. So I'll let you take it away.
I am really upset that you think that his family is a bigger fan of him than I am. JaMychal Green just fills so many gaps and does so in these measured doses that it's sort of easy to overlook. And he definitely does have his imperfections where there have been seasons and you're wondering, well, can he shoot just a little bit higher from 3? But he knocked down 36.2% of his trades while he was with the Grizzlies. He became this player that they could play at the 4 or the 5, and the defense isn't always sound when he's at the 5, but he can really move, particularly during his time with Memphis, where he was first kind of coming onto the scene and NBA geeks were becoming aware of him. He really could move well on the perimeter, and he was defending, switching on to pick and roll ball handlers, which is just not easy to do, but also having the strength to kind of double back and cover the roll guys. I do think there's definitely been a role regression and performance regression since he's left Memphis, but we kind of also saw his value last year in the playoffs when in that Warriors series, there was a number of reasons, none of which were necessarily primarily JaMychal Green himself, that the Clippers pushed the Warriors to 6 games, but they used him at the 5, and they absolutely ran the Warriors off the floor during the stints in that series. That's something that I could see the Clippers going back to in this year's playoffs, even though they haven't really leaned on it this season. But for JaMychal Green's time in Memphis specifically, I think he just showed that he was this jack of all trades and maybe master of none. And that's huge in having what you needed to be at that point. Let's say your 5th best player or your 6th best player. To have that type of guy, he was never going to be glamorous, but he just, like I said at the top of this, he just filled so many holes. And I think defensively, particularly, I'm not sure he's fully appreciated enough because of all that he can do. And we don't get to see it because his role just isn't that large in Los Angeles, and it wasn't necessarily as big towards the tail end of his time in Memphis either. But he is a really good basketball player. And to be so plug and play and low usage on the offensive end, it makes him easier to fit in onto any roster. And if he does decline his player option this summer, which I actually don't think he will, I do believe he's someone that could end up playing a more prominent role and helping out a very good team.
Do you think that's the longest anyone has talked about JaMychal Green uninterrupted on a podcast ever?
I was going to go on about his closeouts a little bit during some of his stints in Memphis, but I felt like I was just rambling at this point, so I wanted to cut it in a solid 15 minutes.
I have nothing to add about JaMychal Green because I am not the authority on JaMychal Green on this podcast. So anyway, he's tied, a very strange tie. We've had some ties that make sense, like Patrick Beverley and Montrezl Harrell made sense for the Los Angeles Clippers. JaMychal Green being tied with Ja Morant for 6th place with the Memphis Grizzlies, just it feels kind of weird. But that's the result because Morant was 6th from the fans. He was 7th for both you and I. Hard to place just because there is such a lack of there-ness as he's midway through his rookie season. He's only 29th in minutes played for the decade, but he sure as hell has made those minutes count thus far. I feel like as excited as we were when he was entering the league out of Murray State, and as many expectations as followed him into the league, he's exceeded all of them. Like his shooting from the perimeter has been far better than expected. The slightness of his frame has not held him back in a way that some thought it might as he began to establish himself in the NBA. I mean, 17.6 points and 6.9 assists per game in efficient fashion, leading a Memphis team that no one really expected to take a leap this soon into the playoff picture in the always difficult Western Conference. And he's just fun to watch. I mean, if he's not already one of your absolute favorite players in the league to watch on a nightly basis, I think you're just watching basketball wrong.
Yeah, this placement was basically saying maybe you could have placed him 5th if you really wanted to, but it was an admittance that there are players who have longer tenures who Morant, most of them, I would say he's going to end up leapfrogging at some point. And so you just put him here because he hasn't been there that long. Maybe you could put him at number 5 if you wanted to, but it actually ends up feeling like the right spot, where there's a recognition of we need to put him as high as possible, but this is basically as high as possible. And I just don't have anything.
I think it's telling that even the fans didn't have him in the top 5 for the decade.
And I don't really have anything to add to just what you said about his functionality. And there's if you give the keys of an offense to a rookie, he can be erratic and sloppy, but he marries volume and efficiency in a way on a difficulty level that rookies before him just predominantly haven't done. Which brings me to a trivia question for you.
No, we're reversing it here.
Yes, I'm putting the screws to you this time.
What if I refuse to answer?
That's fine. That just means that it's an awesome trivia question, in my opinion. So, Ja Morant is one of 3 other rookies to average at least 20 points, 8 assists, and also posts Morant's current true shooting percentage. I'm sorry. There are only 3 rookies in NBA history who have posted more than 20 points and 8 assists per 36 minutes. Can you name the other 2? Ja Morant is one, and my fun fact was also he has the highest true shooting percentage of these 3 players. But
so Chris Paul's going to be one of the others.
No.
Really? Wow. Okay. I'm going to go all the way back to Oscar Robertson.
He is one.
And then I have 2 names in my head, and I don't know which it's going to be, if it's even going to be one of them. I'm going to go with Tiny Archibald.
It is not him.
All right, my other name was Tyreek Evans.
It is not him.
All right, I'm striking out left and right here.
Trae Young.
My misery. Trae Young. I should have known that. I'm embarrassed that I didn't know that.
CP3, when I was looking, I'm pretty sure he didn't have the points per 36 minutes, which is not surprising at all, given how he likes to play.
Right.
How'd it feel, Adam? How'd it feel to be on that end of the trivia question?
I enjoyed it more than I thought I would.
Oh, all right. Well,
How about that? How about that? No, but back to just Morant and moving away from my trivia humiliation. We typically see two pitfalls for first year point guards who are tasked with team running responsibilities. They don't shoot efficiently. Well, so much for that. I mean, he's a fantastic finisher. He's making a bunch of threes. And then we also see a lot of turnover issues. And we're not seeing that either. I mean, 3.2 turnovers per game while playing 30 minutes per contest and having this much responsibility to create everything for this offense. And he doesn't make those mistakes. Like the sky feels like the limit for this guy. My biggest concern is I just every time I watch him play, I'm like, oh shit, like tonight's going to be the night he gets injured. Because
he needs to learn how to land. Yeah.
He needs to learn how to land. I see a lot of Dwyane Wade in his game, the way that he attacks the basket, that he takes off from like some weird angles, the way that he can manipulate his body and contort it in the air. Wade was a phenomenal faller. I think that's one of the more underappreciated elements of his game was that he knew how to take contact softly. He knew how to land softly, and he stayed healthy because of that. And I really hope that that's what we see with Ja Morant.
The only thing that I think I'd like to see that I feel like he needs to do, because that's about basically his livelihood in this league. I don't want to see him get injured. And I also would like to see, though, this is specifically a want, the 3-point volume to come up. I think it's encouraging given the types of shots that he's taken, and he's at 36.7% from three, but 2.8 attempts per 36 minutes. It feels a little low. That says if you're going to shoot above league average on low volume, then it's going to be fine. And given all the things that he can do inside the arc, it obviously works. But I'd like to see that number come up in time. And again, it probably will, because he's only a rookie.
It's hard to believe that he's only a rookie. And he is also the absolute should-be rookie of the year. Let's make that clear. As great as Zion Williamson has been in 19 games.
And if Zion had a chance to catch him, which he did not in my book, just based off the sample size, it's gone now because you're giving him only 8 regular season games and 27 compared to what Morant's will be if he plays in all 8 of Memphis games.
If they close
67.
the gap, if they close the gap and New Orleans make the playoffs, we're going to hear about how
Right.
Zion should be the rookie of the year. Let's just get it out of the way now. He should not be. There is not the requisite sample size.
This is not a career question. It's rookie of the year. If you think Zion's going to have the better career, that's fine. That's a legitimate debate, but this is rookie of the year, and Ja Morant has very clearly, very obviously been the rookie of the year.
Agreed.
Can you take us
So
to
anyway,
number 5?
let's move on. Speaking of obvious things, this is the first time, this is our 15th episode in this series, looking at the franchise decade rankings. It is the first time that we've had unanimity for the top 5. We had the same player in the 5 spot for the fans, for me, for Dan, and the same all the way up through number 1. So Rudy Gay is the guy here. I think I forget how much time Rudy Gay spent in Memphis. 6th in minutes played for the decade. He spent the first 6+ seasons of his career in Memphis before he was traded to the Toronto Raptors. And it just feels like he's bounced around between the Kings and the Spurs since then, to the point that like I felt like I personally kind of forgot just how good he was at the beginning of his career in Memphis. Like a consistent 20-point per night threat, a guy who could score from every level, a guy who used his athleticism to contribute on the glass, who could put the ball on the floor, who could guard multiple positions. He never really became the superstar that there was a chance he was going to become out of UConn. I mean, entering the league as the number 8 pick in 2006. But I think it's hard to be disappointed with the evolution as well.
He is the closest they've come to having the wing that they've been searching for their entire existence. And he might have even been it at one point, but it was just too early in the NBA's like current movement. If you put today's Rudy Gay, or if you knew what you knew now about how the game was going to be played, or he knew that he was going to need to improve his 3-point shot, which he kind of did starting in Sacramento, even though he had the down year in San Antonio, he had another down year this year. So I take that back. I didn't really pay attention to his splits this year. But I think if you know what you know about the NBA today, and you put Rudy Gay you take that knowledge with Rudy Gay and put him back on the Grizzlies during that, 2006 season and on, or let's say 2007 season, 2007, 2008, which is the first time he cracked 20 points per game. I think that Grizzlies end up being a lot better than they actually were. And so it seemed to be a little bit of that at play. The other thing would be he probably wasn't as efficient inside the arc as he needed to be. And when you were also running so much of your offense through bigs, I think that's what kind of became expendable for Memphis, where they needed someone who in theory would be more plug and play. And that's a tougher thing to search for. But I'm not taking anything away from him. He was really good. And I support everything you just said about him.
Right. In terms of our rankings, I feel like there was never any question that he was going to finish in 5th place, because there are 4 players who are so clearly associated with the entirety of the grit and grind era in Memphis, who are obviously better and more important to the franchise than him. But then there's a significant drop down to the guys like JaMychal Green and Vince Carter and Jaren Jackson Jr., who have spent limited time with the Grizzlies, and then Ja Morant, who obviously is still in the midst of his rookie season and could only rise so high when compared to a guy who did spend over 6 seasons with the team. So this it felt like a lock.
Yeah, I'm with you. This whole order felt like it was going to be unanimous the way it unfolded.
Yeah, I think the only real debate was probably between 4 and 3. Tony Allen finished 4th. Again, unanimity across the board. I think you can make a case that he belonged above Zach Randolph, who checks in at number 3. Probably not in terms of sheer on-court value, in terms of production. But if we talk about how Allen lent his identity in totality to this franchise, I mean, the grit and grind era in Memphis basketball history happens because of him. There are other players who elevated that ceiling, but he gave that team its identity, its toughness, its willingness to compete on defense, to never give up in any game, to play with an edge. When he would yell "first team all defense" to the crowd, like just all of those seminal moments in this era of the franchise's history, they feel like they stemmed from him. And if you are willing to let that sentimentality supersede pure production, I think that there is a case for him to move into the top 3. It's not one that any of us chose to use, but I do think that possibility exists and should be accounted for.
7 season in Memphis, 6 all defense selections. And one of the memories that I'll always have is him defending Kevin Durant when KD's on the Thunder. And we're talking about Durant, who's basically a 7-footer, and Tony Allen, who's 6'4". No, it wasn't always effective, but he was such a nuisance that he basically guarded 1 through 4 at 6'4", mostly 1 through 3. And that's
sometimes on the same possession.
Yeah. So just, I really don't even want to step on the toes of what you just said, because it did feel like the situation where, no, he clearly wasn't the best player on the team, but he infused them with their purpose, with their identity.
Yeah. I think, like, moving on to...
He could be a firecracker in transition. If you want to talk about his offense at all at some points in his career,
right?
If he ever learned to have any semblance of a jump shot, we're probably looking at a career that would have lasted even longer. He did play through his age 35 season. He played 22 games for the Pelicans his age 36 season. A much better player had he even been able to shoot on relatively microscopic volume, 1 3-point attempts per game, and sniffed like 33% even. Something around there.
Right. I mean, there were playoff series where they would have to stick him in the corner and essentially play 4-on-5 on offense. And
the defense has completely left him unattended by the time his Memphis tenure was
and I think
over.
It's telling that, like, no one gave a shit because he was just so impactful on defense.
Right.
They were like, we're going to operate with this disadvantage in the half court set because we know that we still need him.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. But yeah, so Zebo checks in just above him. That portion of the fan vote was actually fairly close, not as close as it was between Randolph and number 2, but it was still somewhat close. Randolph wasn't quite at his peak throughout his Memphis days. He did make the only 2 All-Star games of his career, but you could see the decline happening while he was in Memphis. I think he's largely carried by the early portion of his time on Beale Street. And that time was special, just the low post artist that he was, the physicality that he brought on both ends, his desire to compete for every rebound. If he set a box out against you, you were not getting around him. He created so many second chance opportunities, which I think were largely needed on a team that struggled to produce points and struggled to find good shooters on the wings. But I just can't help but feel like if he had moved, if he was just slightly younger, then this team could have been like a true championship contender with him there.
Yeah, I'm with you. Probably one of the more underrated passers at his position of all time. I feel like it doesn't get talked enough, probably because you were on a team with Marc Gasol for so long. The other thing that kind of surprised me is every time he took those super deep twos, I expected them to go in. And so I just assumed that his accuracy on those during his time in Memphis would be through the roof relative to the league average, but he shot 38.8% on long twos, super long twos, 16 feet up until the 3-point line during his time at Memphis. I actually thought that was low, and it's higher than a lot of players, but I would have guessed that he was between 42 and 45. That's just, anecdotally, that's just credit to Zach Randolph. He made me feel inevitable on long twos when he would jack those up.
He was definitely a player who got to play at the right time. I think that he would have had trouble thriving in today's NBA, I think. Just the switchability wasn't quite there. I don't think he was ever going to develop into a consistently capable three-point shooter. He played at the right time, and he did so much good in Memphis. And I also think that we tend to forget about like how impactful he was within that community too.
Right.
Like, he meant a ton to Memphis. He gave back a ton to his community. And, I think that a lot of people still associate him with the Portland Trailblazers and the Jailblazers era, where there were questions about his maturity and how he was going to comport himself off the court. And he put all of those questions to bed during his time in Memphis. And I feel like that deserves a lot of credit too.
Absolutely. It seems like a genuinely nice guy. I do not know him personally, so I will not say it with any sort of divinity, but emphasizing everything you just said. Also, kind of just a fun fact here, I remember looking at this. I was really hoping he was going to sign one more NBA contract because it would have carried him over the $200 million in career earnings threshold. He's at $199.1 million in earnings for his career, just on the basketball court. He's also a player that I don't think you would necessarily. He was around long enough, but his contracts were also never super massive. And I don't know that he's a player you'd have been like, oh yeah, he definitely made about $200 million throughout his career. So I found that just interesting.
That's like the most Dan Favale thing that you've said on any of these podcasts.
Looking at the career earnings.
Oh yeah, and just the contract nuance and looking at the exact career earnings. I love it.
His highest salary was $17.8 million.
See, now you're just doubling down.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he that's another reason that it would have been interesting if he played slightly later. If he was slightly younger, like imagine how much he would have earned with those Memphis teams.
Kudos to him though for getting that final 2-year deal from the Kings.
Right.
Where it was 2 years and $24 million or whatever it was. Props to him.
That's the one where the Kings were looking to make a playoff push until they were bad, and then they obviously weren't looking to make a playoff push, and they yelled at people who thought they were.
Vince Carter, George Hill, maybe even harassed them via email because of their report card grades. Yeah,
something like that. No names will be mentioned here.
Moving on to number 2.
Number 2 is Mike Conley. I think can you make a case for him at number 1?
That's what I was going to ask you.
Or is it just so obviously Marc Gasol? Because that's the important discussion here. I think we all know just how good Mike Conley was as a two-way point guard. He's not showing it with Utah right now. He might get back to that level, but I mean, he probably won't. He was phenomenal in Memphis. Some people would go so far as saying that he is the second best player in NBA history who never made an All-Star team, behind only Cedric Maxwell. But
you're obligated to quote at least one of my articles per podcast now. This is the second consecutive time that you've done it.
It's on purpose. But no, I don't think there's a case for him over Gasol.
And you know what it is because he never dominated the game. And as we saw, kind of towards the end of his tenure in Memphis, he could do that. And later on in his career, you saw like, oh, Mike Conley can really hit some jumpers off the dribble if he wants to. But and
he kept getting better too.
Right. But his like default nature is unrelenting game manager, is I believe how I put it. Because he's going to put pressure on defenses, but he does it in service of everyone else around him. And then he'll adjust his shot location and volume as needed, basically. And I don't know. I would have liked to have seen. I think his final 2 years.
Can I cut you off real fast?
Yeah.
Are you quoting from your article, or are you just talking off the top of your head?
I'm talking about what I wrote off the top of my head. Why?
The exact quote is Conley's natural role is an unrelenting game manager. He puts pressure on defenses in service of those around him. And both his shot selection and volume can be adjusted as needed, which is like the exact same thing you just said. And I'm just impressed.
If I was reading, I probably wouldn't have stumbled through it as heavily. I would be curious, though, to see how he would have fared. I won't say in a different situation because I don't think Memphis made him. But if his usage was consistently higher, or we saw him put pressure on defenses in service of looking for his own shot first. And not to say that he didn't need to be a high-quality passer, but what would have happened if you gave Mike Conley just more of a license to take off-the-dribble jumpers for more than half of his career, whatever you want to say? Does he make an all-star team? Are the Grizzlies just as good, or are they better? I don't know, but he is definitely one of the best players. You might even say the second best player in NBA history to never make an all-star game.
I don't know that he would have gotten there with more volume, just because the West was just so loaded with backcourt talent throughout his career.
Oh yeah,
it would have been tough to make that cut. And this goes, I mean, I think you know that I've advocated for a long time that all-star rosters need to be expanded to reflect the growing size of the league as a whole. I mean, the fact that it's still the same size that it was back in the 70s when there were so many fewer teams doesn't really make sense. Rosters have also expanded. It's no longer representative of the same top X percentile of NBA players that it used to be. And I think that a change like that really would have benefited somebody like Conley, where 30 years from now, I hope that people are still hyping up his game, but it's going to be harder to do that because you're gonna look on his basketball reference page or whatever the website we use in 30 years now. I guess it might not even be a website, and see 0 All-Stars next to his name. And it's unfortunate. He's one of the players who I think is most poorly represented by his lack of accolades.
And look, people gravitate towards the scoring numbers, and you're looking at his first 6 seasons in Memphis. He doesn't average 15 points per game, despite consistently averaging above 30.
One all-defensive team.
Which is also
weird.
Seems
ridiculous.
Yeah, he never just this lockdown defender, but for someone who's like 6 foot, 6'1", to be above average for as long as he was, to the All-Star conversation specifically, or even if you want to say All-NBA, just a brutal time to really enter the league for him. 2007, 2008, so Kobe Bryant still exists, still really good, has his brand, but then you're like, as you're getting deeper into this time, you're talking about Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, Stephen Curry, Damian Lillard. The list continues to go on, and I thought he was going to get moved.
Monte Morris.
Forgot about him, excuse me. Frank Ntilikina in the Eastern Conference, but I just feel like it needs to be said. I thought he was going to get moved before the 2019 trade deadline, and there were talks about it early, and I was like, if he gets moved early enough, if he got shipped to the Detroit Pistons or the Miami Heat, could the coaches just put him into the All-Star game because he would have deserved it?
Absolutely. It's a shame it didn't happen. But even if he had made an All-Star appearance, I don't think that he would have moved past Marc Gasol.
No, I don't. The team was tailored around Marc Gasol more than it was anybody else.
Exactly. And that was true on both ends. I mean, just the passing from the low post and from the elbows, the ability to score from everywhere, the expanding range that we saw towards the end of his time in Memphis, the consistent defensive excellence. I mean, he played like a guy who knew what the play was going to be before the offense did, and then he was in the right spots. And it's why, like, to circle back to you talking about his weight loss at the beginning of this podcast episode, like, I do think that it could really benefit him on defense, if only because he's always been such an instinctual defender. And if he can get to those spots as quickly as he recognizes where those spots are, that's really going to benefit the Raptors in a way that it did earlier in his career with Memphis when he was a Defensive Player of the Year back in 2012-13, because he never found himself in the wrong spot. He never made the wrong decisions. So I hope that that's the level of Marc Gasol play that we get to see. But yeah, I mean, just an obvious face of the franchise and best player in franchise history.
Do you remember there were sort of rumblings that people thought he was just like cooked defensively around 2017? I think it was 2017, 2018, and then 2018, 2019 when he gets traded. But you just got to look at the personnel that's around him at that point in Memphis, and an aging core, because Mike Conley, not exactly young. He had Vince Carter for at least one of those seasons. You had Tony Allen's last season falls within that window, I believe, there too. And he really proved that wrong since moving to Toronto. But just his entire time as a defensive anchor in Memphis, basically, so smart. And since we talked about it twice now, because we talked about it at the top of the podcast, I tend to agree with what you're saying about how he'll end up moving. But just somebody that basically decided to erase Joel Embiid in the playoffs last year, and even Nikola Vucevic just destroyed the guy in round one. Those might be the matchups I'd be more concerned about. But then, like you said, because he's so intelligible on the defensive end, he might figure out whatever he gives up in strength. Now he'll figure out how to make it up in spacing, in timing, because that was so much of what he did in Memphis for basically his entire career.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know he didn't like David Fizdale, but you have to appreciate that all of a sudden he goes from not chucking threes at all to just jacking 3.6 per game on a 38.8% clip.
And it was definitely a scheme adjustment rather than him putting in like work in the offseason or anything, because he's always been a good shooter in European play and the FIBA competitions that he and his brother Pau Gasol have dominated in for years. Like granted, FIBA plays with a slightly shorter arc, but he's always shown that capability, and it just wasn't unleashed in Memphis until later in his tenure there.
And also, I'm excluding this season because he only appeared in 36 games and he's shooting 8.3% on long twos, which don't account for basically any of his shot distribution anymore. But before that, including last year and for the rest of his career, 42.4% on long twos.
Yeah.
So there was that floor spacing element. It was just never dragged beyond the 3-point line until later.
It's very difficult to find areas of Marc Gasol's game to complain about. I think that's the easiest way to put it.
And the passing too. There was a flair to it. Just you wanted to, not Nikola Jokic, because he's like this different kind of event.
But he had some of those. He had some of those like behind the back no look feeds to baseline cutters. Like that's probably the pass I associate with Gasol so prominently. It's like that he just knew where everyone was at all times without looking on both ends.
Just Devers, he was more nonchalant about it, I feel like, where Nikola Jokic is throwing like things from such ridiculous distances that it's almost in your face, even though he's not necessarily celebrating after each of these dimes. Just nonchalant greatness when it came to passing is probably the best way to put it.
Yep. You ready for some honorable mentions?
I am.
So we had OJ Mayo at 9 in the fan vote, which knocked Jonas Valanciunas down to 11. But beyond that, we had Courtney Lee and Shane Battier were tied for 12th. Mike Miller in 14th. Dylan Brooks in 15th, who I considered him for my 10 spot. I think his
Dylan Brooks or Marshawn Brooks?
Both, but
Aaron
Dylan
Brooks?
Any of the Brooks. I like Dylan Brooks's flammability on offense. I like the intensity he plays with on defense, even if the results haven't always been there. And I feel like he could grow into a guy who is an obvious top 10 lock in the next decade.
Maybe this is a hot take. I don't think his extension is going to end up aging well. I'm just not sold on him just yet. He feels a little too streaky for me. I'm going to have to bring on a Grizzlies expert, Sharon Brown or somebody, to talk about that at one point. Definitely for a different podcast, but I'm much lower.
We'll check in on that in a decade. But beyond Dylan Brooks, we had Tayshaun Prince at 16, Tyreek Evans at 17, Pau Gasol at 18, Grievous Vasquez at 19, Bino Udre at 20, who was tied with Darrell Arthur and Quincy Pondexter. 23rd, we had a tie between Jason Williams, Maurice Spates, and Tony Roden. Brandon Clark was 26th, tied with John Conchar, and Jared Bayless was 28th with Kyle Lowry, And at 30th was Costa Koufos and Sam Young. Of those names, I think I'm most surprised that Brandon Clark didn't get more love, just knowing that the fans were willing to overlook Ja Morant's lack of there-ness and put him as an obvious top 10 inclusion. Just that he barely appeared on any ballots and didn't finish higher than 10th on a single ballot was interesting to me, given how efficiently he's played and how obviously impactful he is as a rookie.
Yeah, you would think just didn't necessarily deserve to be in the top 10 when you're looking at sample size.
I'm not saying, definitely not saying he deserved it.
I'm with you. Where did Tony Allen, where did Courtney Lee fall in the honorable mentions? Did I miss him?
He was 12th, tied with Shane Battier.
All right, so closer than I just must not have heard you say him. Because he's 7th in minutes for the decade on the Grizzlies, which was
a tough cut.
When I saw that, I was flabbergasted. I didn't think he would be that high.
Right, and when we were talking about it before we recorded, as we were going through and making our own ballots separately, I think both of us were taken aback that he was that prominent on the minutes leaderboard.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed top 10, to be honest with you, in minutes.
I would not have either, yeah.
That does it for us, though. We will have the Miami Heat podcast for you eventually. That form is already up. Go to NBA._math and look for it, or you can check my Twitter feed. I'll retweet it as well. Fill it out. We'll be recording it soon. Until next time, though, we leave you with a shout out to Grizzlies legend, should have his jersey retired, Ray McCallum.